Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, I want you to imagine dedicating 20 years of your life to building an empire.
Well, that's a long time.
Right. 20 years. You manage every crisis flawlessly, you secure the entire foundation of the organization, and then, out of nowhere, you get fired. And you get fired simply because the CEO had this sudden, quote-unquote, moral awakening.
Ah, yes, the convenient moral awakening.
Exactly. An awakening that just miraculously happened to align with his desire to date his secretary.
Yeah, that sounds like a headline from like a modern corporate scandal, right?
It really does. But it's not. That is actually the 16th century court of King Henry VIII.
It is entirely that.
Is it?
Well, it's the ultimate case study in institutional gaslighting. And when we really examine Shakespeare's play, King Henry VIII, we are essentially looking at this diagnostic manual.
A diagnostic manual.
Yeah, a manual for how toxic power structures operate, how ambition just cannibalizes itself, and most importantly, what it actually takes to survive when the entire system is rigged against you.
Right. And to really understand these mechanisms, we are doing a deep dive into Shakespeare's text, but we're pairing it with the commentary of the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt.
Hazlitt is just indispensable here. I mean, he serves as our intellectual scalpel.
I love that.
He really does, though. He completely refuses to be blinded by all the royal pageantry. Instead, he just dismantles the mythology surrounding Henry. He exposes the raw, predatory human behaviors underneath all that velvet and gold.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are going to extract the enduring lessons from this text.
Yeah.
We're looking at that brutal collision between the pursuit of power and, well, the demands of an individual's conscience.
And Shakespeare establishes this core tension so brilliantly. He doesn't do it with some quiet moral soliloquy.
No, not at all.
He does it with a display of just unimaginable, overwhelming wealth. So the play opens with a recounting of the Field of the Cloth of Gold.
Right, which historically, that was this massive diplomatic summit, right, between Henry VIII and the French king, Francis I.
Historically, yes, but practically. Practically, it was an arms race of sheer vanity.
An arms race of vanity, yeah.
The Duke of Norfolk describes the French as being, all clean-quant, all in gold, like he's and gods.
Clean-quant, just glittering.
Exactly. While the English side made Britain look like a literal mine of wealth. And the text really emphasizes the physical burden of this display. The men are literally sweating under the sheer weight of the gold and the pride they are forced to carry.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
It was an event so aggressively opulent that each day tried to outdo the last. It rendered the previous day's excess looking like, as the text says, a fool and beggar.
What really fascinates me about the Field of the Cloth of Gold is the mechanical function of it. Or rather, the lack of function.
Right.
Because it achieved absolutely nothing diplomatically. I mean, it was just this geopolitical posturing that completely bankrupted the nobility who were forced to participate.
Oh, totally bankrupted them.
And Shakespeare is so intentional by starting the narrative right there. He constructs this towering, blinding image of earthly glory, but the prologue has already primed us to anticipate the structural collapse.
Yeah, the prologue is very clear. It warns the audience, I come no more to make you laugh.
Yeah, it's dark from the jump. We are promised a spectacle of greatness surrounded by 1,000 friends that will just instantaneously shatter into absolute ruin.
And the architect of both that magnificent facade and its eventual ruin is Cardinal Wolsey.
Wolsey, wow, what a character.
He really is the ultimate manifestation of weaponized ambition. I mean, he was a man of low birth. He was famously derided by the nobility as a butcher's cur.
A butcher's cur, that's harsh.
Very. But he somehow engineered his ascent to become the second most powerful man in the entire kingdom. And the nobles, well, they despise him. Not just for his power, but for exactly how he acquired it.
Right, and Norfolk compares Wolsey to a spider, which I find so telling.
Oh, it's a brilliant metaphor. Norfolk notes that out of his self-drawing web, he gives us note, the force of his own merit makes his way.
I really want to linger on that spider metaphor for a second, because it operates on so many levels. Like, a spider doesn't inherit a fortress, right?
No.
It extrudes its web from its own entrails. Wolsey spun his power out of his own cunning. I mean, he manipulated foreign policy, he orchestrated purges, he drained the kingdom's liquidity through heavy taxation.
And all of that extraction was just to accumulate mountains of capital. His ultimate objective was literally to buy the papacy.
To buy the Pope's seat. It's just a terrifyingly pure form of meritocracy. He built himself from absolutely nothing.
He did.
But then when we look at his eventual catastrophic fall, where he loses the king's favor and is just stripped of everything, he delivers that really famous realization, vain pomp and glory of this world, I hate you.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, does he actually achieve a moral awakening there? Or is this just the lament of a gambler who's upset that the casino finally took all his chips?
That is the pivotal question regarding Wolsey, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Hazlitt argues that there is a profound existential crisis occurring in that moment.
Really? So it is genuine?
Well, stripped of his wealth, his titles, and his access to the king, Wolsey is forced to confront the absolute void at the center of his life's project. He realizes that he has spent decades just hanging on the precarious smiles of princes.
The precarious smiles of princes, wow.
The realization is that earthly power is not a possession, right? It's a lease. And the landlord is highly capricious. It takes the total demolition of his worldly identity for his heart to new open.
So let's contrast Wolsey's structural collapse with the other massive figure in this ecosystem, which is Queen Catherine.
Catherine, yes.
Hazlitt describes Catherine as the perfect delineation of matronly dignity, sweetness, and resignation. I mean, she has been Henry's wife for 20 years.
2 decades of loyalty.
And she is suddenly discarded just because Henry wants a younger wife, Anne Boleyn. Catherine is dragged into this completely rigged court, stripped of her title, and banished.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Yet, unlike Wolsey, she doesn't suffer an existential collapse. I often think of this in terms of, architectural physics.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, Wolsey built a spectacular gilded skyscraper, but the foundation was resting entirely on a sinkhole.
And the sinkhole is the volatile, unpredictable favor of a narcissistic king.
Exactly. One tectonic shift in Henry's mood, and the skyscraper just turns to dust.
Yeah, the physics of Catherine's life are entirely different.
Yeah.
She is a heavy, modest stone fortress, but she is built directly on bedrock.
Bedrock. And what is that bedrock for her?
It's her inner truth, it's her conscience, and her spiritual integrity. The king lays siege to her life, right? The court isolates her, her allies abandon her. The walls of her external circumstances are battered, and she is exiled to die in poverty at Kimbleton. But structurally, internally, she remains perfectly intact. Her dignity isn't derived from the crown she wears. It's derived from her character.
Okay, and I have to push back here. Doesn't that just make her a victim?
In what way?
Well, in a modern context, if a toxic system strips you of everything you have built and you just accept it with sweetness and resignation, like Hazlitt says, aren't you just letting the tyrant win?
I see what you mean.
Why should we revere this kind of passivity?
Because it is not passivity. It's an active, fiercely disciplined retention of self.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Catherine's resignation is not about surrendering to Henry. It is about refusing to let Henry's corruption define her reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because, think about it, to fight Henry on his own terms, to stoop to Wolsey's level of scheming and bribery and deceit that would require Catherine to abandon the very bedrock that keeps her standing.
She'd have to destroy her own foundation to fight him.
Exactly. Hazlitt reveres her because she demonstrates that you can lose the worldly battle while decisively winning the moral war. She refuses to allow the trauma inflicted upon her to degrade her humanity.
That really does clarify it, because to truly gauge the strength of her fortress, we really have to examine the sheer destructive force of the environment she was operating in.
And it was destructive.
Oh, completely unsparing. Hazlitt's assessment of King Henry VIII is just brutal. When we think of historical tyrants, we usually default to someone like, Richard III.
Right, the classic Shakespearean villain.
Yeah, Richard is a monster who murders his nephews in the Tower. But as Hazlitt points out, Richard's cruelty is calculated. He murders out of cold political necessity to secure the throne.
Whereas Henry operates on a completely different and arguably more terrifying psychological frequency.
More terrifying than murdering kids in a tower.
In a psychological sense, yes. Because Hazlitt labels Henry an amorous murderer and an uxorious debauchee.
An uxorious debauchee.
Yeah, meaning he is a man excessively, almost pathologically fond of wives, yet utterly corrupted by his own sensual appetites.
Right.
Henry doesn't destroy people merely because they pose a political threat. He destroys them to indulge his own desires. His power is actually most fatal to those he claims to love intimately.
Which brings us to what I think is the most insidious mechanism in the play, the weaponization of conscience.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Because Henry doesn't just announce, I possess absolute power, I want to marry Anne Boleyn, therefore Catherine is banished. He launders his libido through theology.
He absolutely does.
He masks his lust under the suffocating layer of religious piety.
It is a masterclass in institutional hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Henry claims that his conscience has suddenly received a tenderness, scruple, and prick.
A prick of conscience, sure.
Yeah, he delivers this long, weeping monologue to the court about his sudden, deep-seated fear that his marriage to Catherine, who was his brother's widow, is a sin against heaven.
Right, and he claims that this divine displeasure is the reason they lack a male heir.
And the timing is miraculously convenient, isn't it?
Miraculous. His conscience begins to agonize him at the exact historical moment he notices the young, beautiful Anne Boleyn, whom, by the way, he immediately promotes to Marchioness of Pembroke and just showers with wealth.
Yeah, Hazlitt pinpoints this exact pathology. Henry possesses a hardened insensibility to the feelings of others, which is strengthened by the most profligate self-indulgence.
Right.
When a leader claims that their destructive, self-serving actions are actually mandated by a higher moral duty, well, it creates an impossible environment. You cannot argue with them without appearing to argue against God or against the state.
And the collateral damage of this hypocrisy, it extends way beyond the royal bedchamber. The entire state bleeds to sustain the king's vanity and Wolsey's ambition.
Yes. Look at the Duke of Buckingham.
Exactly. A noble and competent man marched to the executioner's block entirely because Wolsey's paranoia required a scapegoat.
And look at the economic devastation. Queen Catherine actually disrupts the court to present the grievances of the common people. Wolsey has enacted commissions demanding a sixth part of every man's substance.
A sixth part. That's a 16% wealth tax, effective immediately on the gross assets of every citizen.
Just completely devastating.
It drains the liquidity of the entire working class, the weavers, the spinsters, the clothiers. They are starving.
Yeah.
They are pushed to the brink of armed rebellion.
And this macroeconomic fallout is purely the result of a system designed to feed the ego of the elite.
Which leads to this atmosphere of suffocating psychological terror. And I think it's perfectly encapsulated by Henry's catchphrase in the play.
Ah, yes, the ha.
The ha. Throughout the play, whenever someone displeases Henry or introduces even a slight variable he doesn't like, he simply barks, ha.
Hazlitt actually compares this to the first startling sound that breaks from a thundercloud.
A thundercloud, exactly. I mean, I think of Henry's court as this high-frequency trading algorithm.
Okay, I'm following you.
It operates at a speed and a ruthlessness where one microscopic error in your code, one slight misstep in your phrasing, instantly liquidates your entire life's portfolio.
Yes, that's exactly it.
So how does a society or an organization function when the ultimate authority is entirely driven by appetite, but demands to be treated as infallible?
It functions through the mass production of sycophants.
Sycophants, yeah.
Truth becomes treason. Everyone in the system becomes a mirror, carefully angled to reflect and validate the leader's delusions.
Wow.
The only way to survive is to become complicit, which is exactly how we translate this ancient text into 21st century realities. Because the dynamics of Henry's court are alive and well in modern boardrooms, political arenas, and even toxic family systems.
Let's bring this directly into the modern career landscape, because the modern Henry is the archetypal toxic CEO or, a narcissistic leader.
Oh, absolutely.
They use the corporate equivalent of Henry's religious conscience to justify raw greed. I mean, think about a CEO who lays off 20% of the workforce, devastating thousands of families.
Right.
They don't say, I am doing this to inflate the stock price so my options vest.
Oh, never. They cite macroeconomic headwinds or fiduciary duty or the need to pivot for global synergy.
Global synergy, yes. They mask their self-interest in this untouchable language of corporate responsibility, and then they walk away with a multi-million-dollar bonus.
It is the exact same mechanism of institutional gaslighting. I am only divorcing Catherine because God is upset with me becomes I am only firing you because we need to optimize our core deliverables.
It's the same script.
In both cases, the language of virtue is hijacked to facilitate cruelty. And the people who thrive in these modern environments are the Wolseys.
The enablers.
Yes, the fixers. The ones who execute the dirty work while insulating the leader from the consequences.
But, and I think this is crucial, the play demonstrates that even the enablers are never truly safe.
No one is safe.
I am completely fascinated by the mechanics of Wolsey's fall, because he doesn't fall because of some brilliant counter coup by his enemy.
No, it's not some grand political chess move.
Yeah. He falls due to an astonishing, unforced administrative error.
That's almost comical.
It really is. So Wolsey has been secretly hoarding wealth, keeping a private, detailed inventory of his unimaginable riches, which was intended to bribe his way to the papacy.
And he's also drafted a secret letter to the Pope, actively undermining the king's divorce.
Right. And then, in a rush, he accidentally slips both of these highly incriminating documents into a routine packet of state papers and hands it directly to King Henry.
It is the ultimate administrative catastrophe.
It is the ultimate accidental reply-all of doom.
Huh. Yeah.
It's the equivalent of drafting an email containing a spreadsheet of highly confidential, wildly inflated executive salaries and accidentally hitting reply all to the entire company instead of the finance team.
Which happens.
It does. But I have to ask, for a man who was surgically precise, who navigated lethal political waters for decades, how does he make such a catastrophic rookie mistake? Was it sheer arrogance, or was the shadow system he built simply too complex to manage?
It's the inevitable cognitive overload of maintaining deception at scale.
Cognitive overload.
Yes. When you operate a shadow inventory of your life, when you are constantly managing what you say to the king, what you say to the pope, what you hide from the nobles, and what you extract from the peasants, your cognitive bandwidth is stretched to the absolute breaking point.
You just can't keep track of the lies.
The system becomes too complex. One slip of the finger, one misrouted packet, and the facade shatters. The king reads the inventory, realizes Wolsey's true allegiance is to himself, and the cardinal's career evaporates in seconds.
It exposes the extreme fragility of any empire built on deception.
Exactly.
So let's pivot to Catherine's modern equivalent, because Catherine's arc is the blueprint for anyone who has ever been unjustly squeezed out of an organization.
It is a very familiar story, unfortunately.
It is. Imagine you have performed a role flawlessly for 2 decades. You built the department. You mentored the staff. You hit every metric.
You're the bedrock.
You are. And then suddenly, leadership decides they want a newer model. They want an executive who looks better on a magazine cover, or who just won't push back on unethical directives.
But the leadership cannot terminate you without cause. That exposes them to liability or reputational damage.
Right, they need a pretext.
So they engineer a process to legitimize your removal. They initiate a sudden performance review. They bring in external consultants, in Catherine's case, Cardinal Wolsey, and the papal legate, Cardinal Campeius.
Right, the outside HR firm.
Exactly. They bring them in to find a technicality, a manufactured flaw, to justify pushing you out. And this brings us to the trial of Blackfriars.
Catherine's defense at Blackfriars is an absolute masterclass in professional self-advocacy. She doesn't scream, she doesn't throw a tantrum, and she doesn't beg.
No, it's highly disciplined.
She executes a highly calculated response. And this gives us our first real set of practical tools. How do we take the lessons from Wolsey and Catherine and apply them to our own daily lives?
Well, we can crystallize this into specific practices. So let's begin with avoiding the Wolsey trap, which we can call the inventory check.
The inventory check.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before his fall, Wolsey was so consumed by his end goal of the papacy that he completely lost situational awareness.
Right. And he has this incredible line where he describes his career as swimming for many summers in a sea of glory, supported only by bladders, like those little inflatable flotation devices kids use.
Water wings, basically.
Yeah, water wings. He thought he was a master of the ocean, but he was entirely dependent on these fragile pockets of air.
And when the king popped the bladders, Wolsey realized he was in deep water and he sank.
If you rely on external air, a single pinprick drowns you.
So the practice here is a rigorous self-audit.
Okay, what does that look like?
Ask yourself, what are you hoarding in your own life? Are you hoarding status? Are you hoarding control in your relationships? Are you obsessed with projecting a specific image on social media or in the office? Take inventory of the bladders keeping you afloat. If your sense of self-worth is entirely tethered to a specific job title or a specific relationship or a specific level of income, you are operating far beyond your depth.
You're vulnerable to a pinprick.
Exactly. You must build internal buoyancy. That means skills, character, and relationships that remain intact even if the external circumstances shift.
So don't wait for a disastrous reply-all moment to realize your entire life is built on a fragile facade.
Honestly.
Let's move to the second practice, which is the Catherine response to systemic injustice. When you find yourself in that rigged performance review or dealing with a toxic family dynamic where the narrative has already been written against you, how do you defend yourself without compromising your humanity?
You apply Catherine's three-step framework from Blackfriars.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Step 1. State your true record calmly and objectively. Do not allow emotion to cloud the facts. Catherine looks directly at Henry and states, "I have been to you a true and humble wife." She lays out her undeniable 2-decade track record of loyalty and competence. She anchors the conversation in empirical reality.
And step 2, call out the bias directly. I mean, she doesn't pretend the external consultants are neutral.
Not at all.
She turns to Wolsey, the actual architect of her ruin, and says, "I utterly abhor, yea, from my soul, refuse you for my judge."
It's so powerful.
It is. If you know the HR process is rigged or the mediator is compromised, you name the conflict of interest. You refuse to validate a corrupt process by pretending its rules are fair.
And then there's step 3, which is the most difficult but arguably the most crucial. Remove yourself with your dignity intact.
Yeah, let's talk about this.
After Catherine delivers her defense, she turns to leave. The king orders her to be called back. "Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court."
And she just keeps walking.
She doesn't stop.
Her attendant points out she's being called, and she says, "I will not tarry, no, nor evermore upon this business my appearance make in any of their courts."
It's a complete refusal to engage further.
I love this moment, I really do. But I also struggle with it.
Why is that?
Well, in a modern corporate battle, if you just walk out the door, the toxic boss wins the lawsuit, right? They keep the money. They get exactly what they wanted. So why is walking away framed as a victory?
I get that, but it's because it is the preservation of your inner capital.
Inner capital.
Yes. Engaging in a protracted, mud-slinging fight in a court that is controlled by your enemy guarantees only one thing. You will become covered in mud.
Yeah, it's fair.
You will expend years of your life, massive amounts of psychological energy, and likely compromise your own ethics, trying to beat a tyrant at their own game.
Trying to outspider the spider.
Exactly. Catherine recognizes that the institution is irreparably broken. By walking away, she reclaims her agency. She decides that her peace and her integrity are more valuable than a crown that requires her to grovel.
Wow.
Sometimes, the most commanding, powerful action you can take is to physically remove your energy from a toxic space.
That requires immense discipline. But I think that discipline pales in comparison to the third practice, which is radical forgiveness.
Oh, this is a challenging one.
It happens near the end of the play at Kimbleton. Catherine is on her deathbed. She is impoverished, physically ruined, and permanently exiled.
And her gentleman usher, Griffith, brings her the news that Cardinal Wolsey, the man who engineered her destruction, has died.
Right. And Catherine's initial reaction is deeply human and honestly historically accurate. She does not immediately offer absolution.
No, she doesn't. She acknowledges the objective reality of his cruelty. She describes him as a man of unbounded stomach who manipulated the kingdom, whose promises were mighty, but whose actual performance was hollow.
She refuses to sanitize the harm he caused.
Which is important.
Right. But then Griffith gently asks for permission to speak some good of Wolsey. He talks about how Wolsey was a brilliant scholar, how he was deeply generous to his immediate friends, and how after his colossal fall, he finally found a measure of humility and died in peace.
And Catherine's response here is, well, it's profound.
It actually frustrates me. She listens to this and she says, "Whom I most hated living, thou hast made me with thy religious truth and modesty, now in his ashes honor."
She forgives him.
She forgives him. Why should she offer an ounce of grace to the man who destroyed her life? It just feels like she is rolling over completely.
I completely understand the revulsion to this, but we must view it through the lens of psychological utility.
Okay, unpack that.
Forgiveness, in this specific context, is not about absolving Wolsey of his crimes. Wolsey's dead, right? The forgiveness does absolutely nothing for him.
It doesn't help him at all.
No. It is entirely for Catherine. To carry hatred onto your deathbed is to allow your enemy to occupy your final moments.
Oh, wow.
By acknowledging Wolsey's complex humanity, that he was both a monster and a scholar, both a tyrant and a frightened fallen man, she neutralizes the emotional hold he has over her.
She takes her power back.
Exactly. Releasing the bitterness is the final act of detoxifying her soul. She lets the poison go so she can die in absolute, uncorrupted peace.
That is a staggering level of emotional intelligence, but I think it brings us directly to the obstacles to growth. Because why do we fundamentally resist this wisdom?
We do resist it.
Even if we logically understand that Catherine's path is the most moral and the most psychologically sound, it remains profoundly countercultural today. It makes us uncomfortable.
Well, we resist it primarily because of what we could call the allure of the hustle.
The allure of the hustle.
Modern society claims to admire Catherine, but our entire economic and social infrastructure is actually designed to reward the Wolseys.
That's so true.
We are indoctrinated into the meritocracy. We are taught to be spiders, right? To hustle, to network ruthlessly, to build our personal brands, and to accumulate influence by any means necessary.
I mean, the American dream is essentially Wolsey's playbook, minus the treason.
Exactly.
The idea that the force of your own merit makes your way. We look at Wolsey's relentless drive, and a part of us thinks, sure, he was ruthless, but look at the scale of what he built. Look at the wealth he commanded.
And rejecting Wolsey's path feels terrifying because it feels like rejecting ambition itself.
Yeah, we're afraid that if we don't adopt a little bit of Wolsey's venom, we're just going to be eaten alive in the marketplace.
And exactly that fear leads to the second obstacle, our fundamental misunderstanding of Catherine's resignation.
Right.
We project our own desire for retribution onto her story. In Act 3, when Campeius and Wolsey come to her apartments and advise her to place her trust in the king's protection, she brilliantly dissects their hypocrisy and refuses to trust them.
She sees right through them.
She does. Yet ultimately, she accepts her fate. She doesn't raise an army in Spain. She doesn't attempt to assassinate Henry.
And modern audiences hate that. We want the revenge thriller, you know?
We really do.
We want the girl boss Catherine to march into Whitehall, throw a goblet of wine in Henry's face, burn the palace to the ground, and take the throne.
It would make a great movie.
It would. But because she refuses to do that, we mistake her spiritual resignation for worldly defeat. The hardest obstacle to overcome is recognizing that sometimes preserving your inner spiritual integrity is the ultimate act of rebellion.
It is.
Refusing to let a toxic system turn you into a monster is a total victory, even if it costs you your job, your status, or your comfort.
It just demands a complete paradigm shift regarding how we measure success. And Hazlitt presents us with a third, deeply uncomfortable obstacle, the pity of the fallen.
The pity of the fallen.
Hazlitt keenly observes that after Wolsey is stripped of his power, there is a childlike simplicity in his helplessness.
It is genuinely pathetic to watch. I mean, Wolsey turns to his servant Cromwell and says, I am a poor fallen man, unworthy now to be thy lord and master.
He's completely broken.
He actively weeps. He tells Cromwell to abandon him and seek the king's favor to survive. It is a heartbreaking display of vulnerability.
And the thing is, we despise feeling heartbroken for a corrupt billionaire. We want our villains to remain one-dimensional monsters so we can cleanly enjoy their destruction. When a corrupt CEO is led away in handcuffs, society wants to cheer.
Right, it's cathartic.
But Shakespeare, and Hazlitt by extension, forces us to confront the humanity of our enemies. To see the frightened, stripped-down human being beneath the tyrant's mask challenges our self-righteousness.
It really does.
It is incredibly difficult to relinquish the satisfaction we feel in someone else's ruin, but doing so is a requirement for true moral maturity.
This brings up a critical juncture in how we process this entire text. Because as much as we are extracting profound human wisdom, we cannot lose sight of the historical reality.
Right, context matters.
We cannot blindly swallow everything Shakespeare offers us as objective truth. We have to practice wisdom with discernment, which means separating the enduring human truths from the layers of royal propaganda that are just woven into the play.
This is an essential critical thinking exercise. A text can contain profound existential truths while simultaneously operating as a piece of political machinery.
Yeah.
And we see this most blatantly in the final act of the play.
Act 5. So, the narrative has completely moved past the tragedies of Catherine and Wolsey at this point. King Henry has married Anne Boleyn, and she has given birth to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I.
And Archbishop Cranmer, who is now the king's primary spiritual enabler, baptizes the baby and delivers this sweeping, glorious, seemingly divine prophecy about her future reign.
Right. What does he say?
Cranmer proclaims that this infant will bring 1,000 blessings to the land. He prophesies a golden age where every man shall eat in safety under his own vine and sing the merry songs of peace.
Sounds idyllic.
But more importantly, he prophesies that when she dies, from her ashes will rise another heir, as great and famous she was, who will continue this legacy of peace, plenty, love, and truth.
Okay, so let's decode the politics here, because the heir Cranmer is prophesying is King James I. James was literally sitting on the throne of England when this play was likely being performed or adapted. So this monologue is not ancient wisdom. It is pure, unadulterated public relations.
It's PR.
It's a 16th century political campaign designed to legitimize the Tudor and Stuart dynasties and just flatter the current monarch.
Structurally, the play attempts to argue a very specific, sanitized version of history. It tries to present Henry as a majestic, albeit occasionally misguided, monarch who eventually roots out the corrupt elements of his court like Wolsey and protects the pure, reforming elements like Cranmer.
Right, it's spinning the narrative.
It attempts to suggest that the institution of the monarchy is inherently divine and good, and any suffering was merely the result of bad advisors.
And this is where Hazlitt's commentary serves as the perfect antidote, because Hazlitt is impervious to the royal glamour.
Completely immune to it.
He sees right through the PR campaign, and he delivers this piercing insight. He says, no reader of history can be a lover of kings.
It is a devastating critique of institutional power. Hazlitt argues that monarchs, in the abstract, are disagreeable characters.
Yeah.
It's only their immense power, the splendor of their courts, and our innate fear of them that dazzles our imagination. When you strip away the gold cloths, the pretensions of absolute power look completely monstrous.
So the discernment required from you, the listener, is to aggressively separate the individual human experiences from the institutional propaganda.
Exactly.
You can and should internalize the deep wisdom of Wolsey's existential crisis. You must learn from Catherine's fortress-like dignity and her radical forgiveness. You can mourn the Duke of Buckingham's stoic march to his execution. But you must not buy into the propaganda that the institution that crushed them is inherently noble.
Do not let the beautifully crafted mission statements blind you.
Right.
Whether you are analyzing a 16th century monarchy or a 21st century multinational corporation, you must judge the institution by its actual human toll.
Look at the bodies it leaves in its wake.
Look at the burnout it causes and the families it disrupts, not the glossy press releases it publishes.
That is a crucial framework for navigating modern life. Which brings us to our final lens for today, comparative insight.
Yes, zooming out.
If we zoom out from the specific Tudor context, we can see how these struggles map onto the broader human experience across entirely different cultures, eras, and wisdom traditions. Shakespeare is capturing something universally true about the human condition.
Let's examine the illusion of permanence, for example.
Okay.
Return to Wolsey's speech about the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hopes. Tomorrow blossoms. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost, which nips his root, and he falls.
It's vivid imagery.
It is. This vivid imagery of sudden, inevitable loss is deeply connected to Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly Buddhist teachings on impermanence.
Because in Buddhism, the root of suffering is clinging to things that are inherently fluid and transient.
Exactly. Wolsey's agony is generated entirely by his delusion that his power, his wealth, and the king's favor were permanent states. He tried to freeze a river, and when it kept flowing, it destroyed him.
We find the exact same diagnosis in Stoicism, too.
We do.
The philosopher Epictetus explicitly warned against tethering your emotional stability to things outside your direct locus of control.
Epictetus would look at Wolsey's ruined state and observe that it was the mathematically guaranteed outcome of his choices.
Yeah, he staked his entire existence on the whim of a volatile prince. By Stoic physics, relying on the external validation of a monarch is a recipe for guaranteed misery.
And in the medieval European tradition, this reality was conceptualized as the Rota Fortunae, or the Wheel of Fortune.
Right, Wheel of Fortune, right.
The goddess Fortuna blindly spins the wheel. One moment you are at the apex, wearing the crown and dispensing justice, and the very next moment the wheel turns, and you are crushed at the bottom.
So across Buddhism, Stoicism, and medieval philosophy, the prescription is identical. Anchor yourself to internal virtue, because external circumstances are guaranteed to change.
There's also a universal dialogue within the text regarding the true burden of power.
Does supreme authority actually yield supreme happiness?
That's the question. And Shakespeare illustrates this beautifully in a quiet, seemingly minor scene with Anne Boleyn before her ascension to the throne. She is conversing with an old lady at court.
The old lady is highly pragmatic, right? She jokes that she would gladly stretch her conscience to become a queen. She views power as a transactional prize.
But Anne Boleyn claims, I would not be a queen for all the riches under heaven.
Now, historically, we know Anne was highly ambitious, so there is irony here. But the sentiment she expresses echoes centuries of philosophical debate.
From Plato's Republic to the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, philosophers have consistently argued that supreme power rarely brings peace. It usually generates supreme paranoia and places a massive target on your back.
To borrow from another of Shakespeare's works, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown.
Precisely. Anne Boleyn believes she is ascending to the ultimate triumph, but the audience knows she is merely walking toward a different executioner's block a few years later. The pursuit of power is a labyrinth that disguises itself as a sanctuary.
It is staggering how precisely these themes resonate through time. From the treacherous halls of a Tudor palace to a critic's desk in the 19th century, straight into the boardrooms and smartphone screens of today.
The technology changes, but the human heart remains exactly the same.
The bladders of pride still pop, the sinkholes of toxic leadership still swallow the gilded skyscrapers of ambition.
But the bedrock also remains available to us. The quiet, unshakable dignity of a Catherine, the capacity to retain your moral center when the world turns against you, is just as possible today as it was 500 years ago. It simply requires the discipline to choose it.
I want to leave you with one final, provocative image from the very end of the text to mull over on your own. During the massive, glittering celebration for the royal christening, Shakespeare cuts away to a chaotic scene at the palace doors.
A great scene.
A porter and his man are struggling to hold back a massive, surging, screaming crowd of everyday people trying to get a glimpse of the spectacle. The porter complains about the fry of fornication at the door, joking that this one royal christening will beget 1,000 more pregnancies because the crowd is so rowdy, physical, and intensely full of life.
It is messy, it is loud, and it is entirely vulgar.
But consider the contrast. No matter what the kings, queens, and cardinals are scheming in their sterile, gilded chambers, no matter who is losing their head, stealing a kingdom, or plotting a betrayal, the overwhelming, messy, unstoppable tide of everyday humanity just keeps pushing at the doors.
They are not concerned with the papacy or the geopolitical machinations of France. They are simply alive.
So, are you spending too much of your time and emotional bandwidth worrying about the schemes of the elite, the politics of the corner office, or the toxic games of the people in power? When, in reality, the true vitality, the real pulse of life, is right there in the messy, everyday crowd. Think about where you are building your fortress and make absolutely sure it isn't resting on someone else's sinkhole. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.